Okay, welcome to my lecture called The Egg Logic of the Head. And it's always about this time in the semester that I like us to remind ourselves that the head is a simple egg volume, or at least remind ourselves to try to think about it that way sometimes. Because we start to talk about features now in the semester. We're talking about the eyes. Soon we'll be talking about the nose and mouth and all the details that follow. And we can easily lose a sense of the bigger, simpler idea, the big picture concepts. And a lot of times these are the concepts that actually make the drawing successful or not successful when we keep our mind on these things. With an egg, we're aware of this oval-linear structure which has broader curvature at the top and a little bit tighter curvature at the pointy end of the egg. We're aware in general that an egg curves downward like this, and it curves upward. So it has what we call vertical curvature. I'm going to turn this light off so that's not casting a shadow. We're aware that an egg has a horizontal turning as well. So as we come across the egg like this, let's draw a horizontal midline across the egg. We appreciate that that has an elliptical shape right now because it's a cross contour around the egg. So the egg has, this is horizontal turning. And when we render, when we seek to apply tones to create the illusion of volume, we want to think about rendering in this horizontal manner, in the same way that we might render in a vertical manner, where we seek to turn the form this way as well. So what I like to do with the egg logic lecture is to turn the chicken egg here into a drawing of a head, so we can appreciate the similarities. So let's do a vertical center line, and this will show us our vertical turning of the form as well, how the egg has roundness in a vertical plane, and how the egg has roundness in a horizontal plane. But therein, of course, those are our axes of the head right there. We have the vertical axis, the midline of the head. The horizontal axis will be the axis through the eyes. So you can see we're setting up the position, the pose of the head. So the first thing that we'll do to start to modify this egg to make it more akin to the human head is we'll cut in the plane of the brow. So right starting at that halfway line, we're going to be carving a rounded downward facing plane onto this structure where really it's the brow ridge cut into the form with a downward facing plane. This does a lot for us to transform our simple egg into the human head. So downward facing planes produce darker values and shadows. So we're with the light coming from this direction, as we can see. We get a highlight up in here on the egg. What will happen is as we enrich this form and start to take steps to make it more akin to the human head, we'll see other highlights pop out. For each form and each subform has its own little light ecosystem, even though it all belongs to the larger system of the egg here. So there's our first big move in translating this egg into the head. It's the plane of the brow. Second is I want to embed on the egg, a lot of these things you'll recall, we want to embed either cylindrical or uh, an orbital spherical convexity that now comes off of the egg, sitting on the egg. So we're going to put basically a bulging convex orb embedded here for the mouth. And mainly what that does for us is it gives us a new form that has under-facing planes. And of course we're going to be pushing this out in a convex manner. So we should see that this starts to get brighter as we essentially put an orb embedded onto the egg. We're going to sculpt this out. But what's important to note here is that even though we start to create subforms, that things are still part of the larger scheme of the egg that everything floats upon. So we start to see these planes face up and therefore getting brighter, but not as bright as the highlight, right? Because the highlight is way up here on these surfaces. These surfaces are facing much more lightward than, look at these planes. All these planes on the egg, they're very lightward facing, right? So they are very bright. This one is lightward facing too, but it lives on a substructure which is starting to turn under and turn down here. So it's not going to be as bright as that one. So these are part of the lessons that come to us from the egg logic of the head, is that it teaches us to start to compare our values around the form. Okay, the human head, different than an egg, has an advancing form of the chin, which comes off of the egg. So we're gonna be editing the shape of the egg a little bit here, and just like the mouth above it, it is has an upward facing area and it has a downward facing area. But we'll just take that terminator from the egg and we'll swoop it right into there. But meanwhile, we've got upward facing planes now starting to happen across the form of the chin that we're adding on. Okay, so we've got downward facing planes, downward facing planes, downward facing planes. I'm going to start to divert the core shadow and terminator. I'm going to divert it over here towards the plane of the brow. Now let's reiterate something about the egg logic of the head. If I look at the light on the form of the chin and I make it extremely bright, I'm not really following the egg logic of the head so much. It's a common thing that we often see in drawing portraiture where we're tempted to make this light on the chin so bright. But in fact, when we compare it to the highlights, we realize that it is getting a little bit darker because it's down here on the egg. It's turning under. Okay, now I'm going to cut in a little bit more of a cheek shape here. A little bit more angularity in the jaw structure. I'm going to carve the plane of forehead starting to face upward. And we'll trim off a little bit of the excess volume of the cranium, not needed. This plane matches with this plane. So we'll see just a little bit of change from the egg logic, but not much. The terminator is going to jump over. And this plane is going to match this plane. Again, terminator jumps a little bit, but not a whole lot. So we're still very close to the egg logic. It's not as round anymore. We put more of a little bit more of a crisp plane change here from a side plane to a more frontal plane, whereas the egg had continuous roundness happening, but it's still similar. All right, let's get into some of the more fun things. Let's look at that center line now. Remember the center line? This is the ambiguous preliminary center line. It's no longer our center line. Our new center line travels forward in space a little bit because the forehead faces up. And then the center line travels back and down because the glabella is part of the brow ridge facing down. All right, now let's just be careful here, but let's ghost in what we think the nose should do. The nose should erupt forward in space. It should have a downward facing plane at the front plane of it. And then it should cut back in space on the underplane. So we're setting up a midline for the nose here. That's not the outline of the nose, that's the midline of the nose. And then we can visualize going around this dental orb that we created and around the midline of the chin. Look at where the midline of the chin is now compared to where it was. So we're taking what was an egg. The center line was back here. But now we've made all these cuts and planar changes to it. Center line cutting across the top of the head now. Okay, so our nose is going to be 3 dimensions, though. It's not going to be a flat, single center line erecting out into space. So we're going to look at the 3 dimensions of it now. It's going to get wider. We can make a footprint for it on the face. And mainly we want to think about how the nose has front planes which face towards the light in this case, and which are upward facing. So they strongly receive the light. And of course, conversely, the nose has under-facing planes, which will receive shadow and also cast shadow. So here I take my eraser and I remove the light shining on the front plane of the nose. So we have an upward facing plane here. So we're going to be departing from these forms that were on the egg. This is a really big change now because this nose travels out into the air, breaks off of the base form. So often the nose has its own little constellation of its own network of planes and lights and shadows. It does depart heavily from the egg logic. It comes off of it, but it starts to create its own thing. So let's remember that for our next lecture coming up on the nose. So we'll have a little side plane now. We want to think about the nose front plane, side planes, under planes of the nose. And of course the fact that the nose erupts so much off of the egg that our light's coming this way, it casts a shadow. Casts a shadow of varying lengths, depends on the angle of the light. Sometimes we can get really fun cast shadows from the nose that zip all the way across the whole mouth, going in and over each lip. It's a lot of fun. So we start to think about comparisons of this form versus this form. And how this is upward facing and this is also upward facing, but this is more upward facing. This really breaks off of the egg and does its own thing, erupting out into space. Whereas this convexity, you could also say it breaks off of the egg, but not as much. It really lives on the egg much more. So it's actually affected by the under turning at this point. The egg is starting to turn under here. So this will not be as brilliant as the light on the nose. And for that reason, the brightest highlights we tend to see on the head will be in the forehead and on the nose. All right, we start to move into the next features, the mouth and the eyes. We've already lectured on the eyes, so one of the principal points that I like to make in the eye is the idea of the eyeball. That everything in the constellation of the eye, the network of the eye, everything revolves around the concept of two spheres that are embedded within a socket. So if we're not reminding ourselves about the concept of those spheres each time we draw the eye and with each part of drawing the eye, then we are not doing the right work. So these are spherical forms. We're just going to shade little mini spheres. They're going to have a values that get darker as they turn away from the light. So remember, the light's coming this way. So the sphere would be shadowed on this bottom 1/4 crescent. Okay, but now let's do some fun things here. Let's put in an iris. And let's do some eyelid action here. And we can, because we started out with the spheres and we're thinking about round turning forms with the egg logic, we're immediately reminded that the sides of the eye are going to be shadowed, and upper planes, especially in the eyelid, these will be catching the light. As you can see, they're more perpendicular to the direction of the light. And the underplanes of the bag of the eye, these start to get shadowed and darker values because they are turning away from the light source. A little bit of brow here to shape and define the eye socket a little bit more. So now we're going into a little bit more organic quality and away from the geometric preconception that started this off. And let's relax this planar change a little bit here. And we are getting there. We want to see our mouth. So we think about how the mouth here will wrap on that oval linear mass, this spherical mass. of the dental orb, and how the upper lip is one of our downward facing planes in the face. You may recall that we made a list of downward facing planes of the human head, and the upper lip was one of them. So it's going to catch shadow. And the lower lip is recessed, but it is upward facing. So while it lives on that orb, and that orb lives on the egg, which is rolling under, we get a moment here where this plane wants to face up and catch its own piece of light. Of course, the lip is often, even though it's upward facing, its value might be mitigated for brightness because of the local color of the lip. The local color, local value, means the color and value that it already is. So we know the lips have a reddish hue to them, regardless of skin type. They're going to get darker and ruddier, warmer in temperature, more blood flow. Now we want to inflate the cheeks a little bit up here. Some volume that is perhaps different than the egg, but we're still working with the egg concept. We haven't departed from the egg significantly. And that's the whole point of this lecture, is that we're sticking with the egg in many ways, even though we are adding things to it. And the idea that we turned the face a little more frontally as a plane. We gave the face more of a front plane and a side plane, different than the egg, which had continuous roundness. That'll allow us to be a little bit brighter across these planes of the face. Now, of course, to go from egg to head, we could use a little bit more cranial structure back here, right? We know this is its own mass, really. And this is fairly round. We know that we could make a cut here to reflect the concept of the jaw. And you can see I'm coming back and I'm editing my Terminator to fit more onto the organic properties of the head now. Instead of an ambiguously round egg. Thinking about where my shadow shapes will lie due to the direction of the light. Okay, so this is starting to conclude the concept of the egg logic of the head. You can see the big point is that even though we have all of these wonderful little structures that we love, the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the chin, ears, we think about how all of that is coordinated on top of a substructure, which is always there, and is always guiding the behaviors of form and therefore of light. But I have something else that I want to incorporate into this. It's a good time to incorporate a subtopic within the idea of the egg logic of the head, and that is something called the hierarchy of the lights. So because the head is an egg and everything is turning from side to side and from top to bottom, the lights that we see on the face are, of course, affected by this. And we, the artists, should be saying, what is the hierarchy of values that we see when we look at the various lights in the face? So I like to think about this concept called the hierarchy of the lights. And that's where we ask ourselves, when we look at our model, what is the brightest highlight? And what is the second brightest highlight? And third? And fourth? And when we can put those into proper order in the drawing, we often see a lot of benefit to the drawing. So usually in the human portrait, almost always, the number one hierarchical highlight in the portrait is going to be found in the forehead. And the reason for that is that we go back to the egg logic. When this was an egg, there was only one highlight on it, and it was about here. And when we look through art history, you can see the old masters really knew this concept. One particular artist to look at who demonstrates this very strongly is Anthony van Dyck, one of the best portrait artists of all time. Anthony van Dyck, 1599 to 1640. Didn't live that long, but one of the best painters of all time. Was a court painter to King Charles I, and painted a heck of a lot of portraits. And always with his portraits, you can see the brightest highlight occurs in the forehead, because he knows that's the most upward-facing plane of the head, in the truest sense, because really the nose, which actually is more upward-facing, is not part of the skull in the sense that it's cartilaginous, whereas this is truly part of the skull. So he makes a statement in his portraits that that's the brightest value, because it really faces up. So we often see the brightest highlight there in the forehead. Second, because the nose is its own little system, almost like a satellite orbiting off of the head, it gets some really bright highlights on it. But these highlights tend to be more of a glare and a refraction of light, because the nose is darker in value. It's often warmer and darker due to more blood flow, and so the highlights have higher contrast to the local temperature and value and color of the nose. So often the second or equal to the forehead might be the highlight of the nose. Now the third brightest lights in the hierarchy of the lights often occur here in the face and the cheeks. And you can see these are the next most upward facing areas of the face. You know, things like eyes, they also face upward, but they're tucked underneath the brow ridge and a little bit tilting down. The whole facade of the eye is a little bit tilting down, as we recall, is one of our downward facing planes. So the brightness on the eye can be mitigated for that reason. But I don't want to make all these equal. I want the forehead, the nose to be the brightest. I want my cheeks to be pretty darn bright, but maybe not as bright. Now you can imagine as we get lower and lower in the face, what tends to happen is that the values they're bright, but they're not as bright as the things up here. And I want to implore you to look out for that and to be vigilant for those kind of value changes. Be looking for it. You know, you're going to ask yourself, what is the hierarchy of lights in the face of my model that I'm drawing? And you're going to put them in order. You're going to identify which ones are the brightest. They may not be the order that I've suggested here. They might be something else based on the pose. The head could be tilted up, for example. The light could be coming from below. That would change everything. So it may not be what I've proposed here, but the whole point is for you to look and consider how the lights are bathing across the form of the face, not just the subforms, but also the deeper foundational form of the egg. All right, I hope this lecture will stay in your mind as you draw portraiture in the future, and help you to analyze both the forms and the behaviors of light on those forms that you see on the model. And I hope that it helps you come up with better and better drawings. One last thing here. We can't let this stand. We're going to have to carve this egg down for a little bit better proportion. I think this is what happens this is why we need to work at an easel, because I'm sitting at a table drawing, and so the top of the drawing gets stretched out. And I also started with an egg that was probably more oblong than a regular chicken egg, so we'll carve that back down. But at least the concepts are consistent with what we need to think about. All right, thanks very much, everyone.